Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating Global Packaging Regulations, Expert Insights and Analysis. So as always, I'll just give a little bit of orientation about the webinar platform before I introduce our speakers for today. The webinar slides are available to the left side of your screen, along with a few helpful links if you'd like to explore and learn more about compliance and risks and how we can help simplify and accelerate your compliance processes. And we want this webinar to be as engaging as possible, so please do send us any questions you may have, and we'll aim to address them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And if you'd like to submit a question for this Q&A session, use the Ask a Question button on the left side of your screen. We will follow up directly with you for any questions that we don't get a chance to cover during this live session also. And at any time, if you're interested in having a member of our team follow up directly with you outside of asking a question during the session, don't hesitate to use the Start a Conversation button at the bottom of your screen. And last but not least, the webinar recording will be sent to you within 24 hours. My name is Orla Morris, and I'm the Content Marketing Manager here with Compliance and Risks. I'm delighted to be joined by our speakers today, starting with Conor O'Donoghue, who is a Regulatory Compliance Specialist in the Global Regulatory Compliance team with Compliance and Risks. Conor supports clients with their compliance obligations in relation to packaging, RoHS, anti-bribery and corruption. Conor holds a Bachelor's of Law and an LLM in Environmental and Natural Resources Law. Thank you so much for joining us today, Conor.
Thank you, Orla. Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here.
We're also joined by Ruan Doherty, a Regulatory Compliance Analyst with Compliance and Risks and in the Global Regulatory Compliance team. In her role, she monitors and analyses global regulatory developments across various industry sectors. Her work is concentrated on a number of key topics, including packaging, single-use plastics, and ESG reporting. Ruan holds a Bachelor of Law and a Master's of Law in International Human Rights Law also. Thank you for joining us today, Ruan.
Thanks, Orla. Really looking forward to the webinar today.
Great. And last but not least, delighted to be joined by Frida, who is a Senior Global Regulatory Compliance Specialist at Compliance and Risks and has over 10 years of experience in regulatory analysis within the electronics and textiles industries. And since joining Compliance and Risks in 2014, she has gained extensive experience in global regulations for packaging, single-use plastics, and the transport of dangerous goods. Frida has an MSc in Environmental Health and Safety Management and a BA in European Studies and German. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Orla. Looking forward to the webinar.
So before we kick off, I just want to give a quick background about compliance and risks for those who are joining us for the first time. At Compliance and Risks, our mission is to help ensure global companies have the tools and information to build safe, sustainable products in a world full of change. We're the trusted product compliance technology provider for the world's leading brands and have spent over 2 decades honing the digital tools, expertise, and content you need to stay ahead of the dynamic regulatory landscape, proving your product's compliance, protecting your brands, and importantly, helping to drive your growth. So here at Compliance and Risks, we have the world's most comprehensive regulatory database with over 100,000 regulations historically available in C2P. And with a global regulatory coverage and expertise across over 10 industries, we understand that regulatory compliance definitely doesn't sleep. And our regulatory expert team is truly global, with 28 languages collectively spoken across the team, all fortified by our 30 knowledge partners. C2P is our enterprise software designed to keep global organizations on top of regulatory changes and their impact worldwide. This includes early warning alerts, impact probability, productivity workflow tools, and so much more. And with that, I'm delighted to hand it over to you, Conor.
Thank you, Orla, and thanks everyone again for joining. So, just before I actually go into the agenda, I'd like to just give everyone some info maybe about the work myself, Ruin and Frida do here in Compliance and Risks. So we're part of a team of over 40 compliance professionals, and one service which we offer to customers is our Ask Our Expert service. So on a daily basis, customers ask us questions about regulations which affect their products. So we thought it would be a good idea to do a webinar covering some of these most frequently asked questions that we get from our customers, in the hope that maybe some of you would also have an interest in these questions. So here is the agenda. So I'll begin by talking a little bit about the new EU packaging regulation, and then I'll also cover Portugal's packaging labelling system. And then I'll pass you over to Ruin, who will discuss US state packaging EPR programs, recyclability labelling obligations in California, and reporting requirements under Canada's Federal Plastics Registry. And then Frida will talk a little bit about UK's EPR scheme for packaging, Saudi Arabia's latest revision to its draft technical regulation on packaging, and finally some insights into India's plastic waste management rules. So I'll get started with some questions we've been getting about the new EU packaging reg, which has probably been the most significant regulatory development in the packaging industry this year. So just to start with some basics, the regulation will generally apply from the 12th of August 26. That's not really the only date that matters, because there's over 20 compliance deadlines ranging all the way from 26 all the way up to 2040. And in many ways, it's a very comprehensive regulation. It places many new obligations on economic operators, ranging from requirements relating to substances and packaging recyclability, reusability, design, labeling. There's so many different topics within the regulation. But at the same time, there's also a lot of question marks surrounding some provisions, especially the provisions which require implementing and delegated acts to be published by the Commission. So I'll jump straight into Article 12 on the labelling requirements, and this is probably the topic which our customers ask us the most about. I'm sure it's given a lot of people a lot of headaches in recent years. So all going well, harmonized material composition labelling will come into force by the 12th of August 2028. Reusable packaging labelling should also come into force from 12th of August 2029. Now, it is possible that those dates will be pushed back if the EU Commission is slow to publish the required implementing acts, but at this point we've no indication that that will be the case. So yes, it's Articles 12.6 and 12.7, which are the two provisions which require the Commission to publish those implementing acts, which will really flesh out the provisions and what economic operators will have to do by those dates. So the Joint Research Centre, the JRC, under the EU Commission, has been working in the background to develop the design of these labels, which will then be incorporated into the implementing acts. And prototype designs have actually already been published, I believe, in May of this year, which I'll show you in a moment. But there's also been concerns raised by many stakeholders in relation to single market barriers that are caused by the proposed labels. So as you can see here, here are some examples of the prototype designs which have been released by the JRC. So as you can see, these designs are quite recognizable. They adopt a recognizable pattern in terms of paper or cardboard being represented by blue, glass is green, yellow for plastic, etc. But as I said, a significant number of industry stakeholders have come forward and said these labels would introduce a significant barrier to intra-EU trade. So, like, on what basis are they saying this? Well, as you can see from the slide in front of you, the JRC has adopted both text and colour in the labels, including the text especially is significant because it may mean that the text needs to be translated into over 20 EU languages, which I suppose directly contradicts the goal of harmonized labeling in the first place, which is to reduce barriers. So I suppose you could say it's somewhat surprising that the JRC are proposing labels which may create additional fragmentation, especially considering that the EU has just published a single market strategy as well. And so I suppose following on from this, a lot of people are asking what will the impact be on national packaging labelling requirements. As most of you probably know, numerous EU countries have introduced mandatory packaging labelling requirements relating to waste sorting. The main countries involved would be France, Spain and Italy. So firstly, Article 12.8 of the EU packaging regulation states that economic operators shall not provide or display labels that are likely to mislead or confuse end users with respect to sustainability requirements. And Commission guidelines are actually being prepared on this, so hopefully we should get some clarification in the near future. And secondly, infringement proceedings have already been launched against France and Spain due to their national labelling requirements. France has actually been referred to the CJEU because of the mandatory application of the Tryman logo. And in their infringement notices, the Commission have used quite strong language stating that these national measures would be disproportionate and that they would seriously undermine the free movement of goods. So I think overall, when it comes to the national labelling requirements, I think it's fair to say that they will all be replaced by the harmonized EU labels when they enter into force, and that these member states will have to repeal their national measures over the coming years. And moving on from labelling, I just also actually wanted to touch on Article 15.6 of the EU packaging reg, which requires, in a similar way, I suppose, to many EU directives and regulations, it requires manufacturers to provide their postal address and contact details on the packaging. Now, we have received a few questions about this article, mainly, I believe, because of the introduction of more modern language that includes phrases relating to the QR codes and digital data carriers, etc. So if we just take a look at Article 15.6, it states that manufacturers shall indicate on the packaging, on a QR code or another data carrier, their name, registered trade name or trademark, as well as the postal address and the electronic means of communication by which they can be contacted. If this is not possible, the information is to be provided through the QR code, the data carrier, or in a document accompanying the product. And the postal address shall indicate a single point at which the manufacturer can be contacted. Now, so we have been asked what is meant by indicating a single point of contact. Now, this isn't defined in the PPWR, it's not in the packaging reg. So guidance can instead be found in the EU's Blue Guide, which is a non-binding document providing guidance on EU product rules and harmonisation legislation. It was most recently updated in 2022. Now, page 57 of that guide states that a single point of contact is where the manufacturer can be contacted, in particular by market surveillance authorities. And only one single point of contact is allowed for each product, and it need not be the manufacturer's actual address. It can actually be the address of the authorized representative or customer services. and also a website address may be given in addition to, but not instead of, a postal address. And we've also been asked, does the electronic means of communication need to be a single point? And the text of Article 15.6 does not require that the electronic means of communication must be a single point of contact. So it may be acceptable to provide a link to a homepage URL, for example, on your website, which then requires some extra steps for the user to find contact details. And just remember that the postal address must still be provided separately. The postal address must provide a single point, which is indicated on the packaging itself, in the QR code, or in the accompanying documentation. So I thought it was interesting that we were receiving questions about Article 15.6, so hopefully that clears up some confusion about this new provision for manufacturers. And actually, unfortunately, that's all we have time for when it comes to the EU packaging reg. I'm sure we could just talk all day about the different measures, but I'm actually going to move on now to packaging labelling in Portugal. And again, this is quite interesting because in 2024, we were actually receiving many questions about Portugal's neighbour, Spain, and their mandatory packaging labelling requirements, which entered into force on the 1st of January of this year. But this year, I think we're getting a lot more questions about Portugal, which has kind of flown under the radar a little bit. So let's take a look. So in 2024, an amendment was made to Decree Law 152D 2017 in Portugal, which created a waste sorting information requirement under Article 28.5 of the decree. So packaging within scope must adopt one of the two following measures. So option 1 is the labelling of non-reusable primary and secondary packaging, indicating the colour of the correct recycling bin where packaging waste must be placed. And option 2 is the provision of information on the destination of packaging waste by any appropriate means, namely in the instructions for use of the packaged product or at points of sale. So it's not a direct packaging labelling requirement because companies have the option to provide information in the instructions or at point and label. But nonetheless, there is a general requirement to provide waste disposal information. So some customers have come to us and told us for whatever reason, mainly maybe some logistical reason, they would rather prefer to comply with Article 28.5 by adopting labels. So that's through option 1. So option 1 states that if a company wishes to label non-reusable packaging to inform the consumer as to which waste receptacle is appropriate, then the labelling must comply with the instructions published by the Portuguese Environment Agency. So these instructions were actually published in December of last year, and they state that the labelling must either contain a symbol indicating the green, blue or yellow recycling bin, or with a phrase stating place in the green, blue, yellow bin. You must also, if the packaging contains different materials, then companies must mark the packaging with symbols and/or phrases indicating the respective bins. Thirdly, if a lid or stopper must be removed or kept on the packaging prior to disposal, then the consumer must be made aware of this. And the labelling must be in Portuguese. And finally, consideration should also be given to providing the instructions in Braille. So that's option 1. And just to mention as well, the Portuguese authorities have not provided official labelling designs. So this is similar to Spain, where the producer themselves must decide which labelling design to use, as long as the requirements here on the screen are met. So for example, we've been asked by some customers whether the Trimin logo can be adapted and used in Portugal. But from our point of view, we would recommend contacting your PRO for guidance on which label would be most appropriate for you to use. So what about option 2? So as a reminder, option 2 allows companies to provide packaging waste disposal information to consumers by any appropriate means, namely in the instructions for use of the packaged product or at points of sale. So the Environment Agency actually published guidance last February where they stated that there are various means whereby you can achieve compliance with this option. So you can provide the information via the packer's website, a QR code placed on the packaging, or in information placed in the instruction manual of the packaged product. So maybe at first glance, this appears to be the easier option compared to having to apply labels, but I know it depends on the company and their own internal compliance measures. And it's also worth mentioning that there are separate mandatory labelling requirements for reusable packaging provided for under Article 28.7 of this decree. But at this point, it seems that these requirements haven't entered into force because consultations with industry stakeholders, which is required under the decree, they just haven't concluded yet. So that's all from me now, unless there are any questions at the end. So I'll hand you over to Ruan, who will discuss the US and Canada. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Connor. So now we're going to take a look at the United States. So extended producer responsibility, or EPR, is always a hot topic for producers, but it's becoming increasingly important now in the US. So as you can see on the map here, as of 2025, 7 states have enacted packaging EPR laws, with Washington and Maryland most recently joining the trend. So outside of these 7 states, a number of other states are actively considering similar legislation, which shows that packaging EPR really is a key trend shaping environmental compliance in the US today. So each state program is now in various stages of implementation. Most recently, implementation began in Oregon in July, making it the first state to actually kick off their program. So interestingly then, on July 30th, the National Association of Wholesaler Distributors, or the NAW, filed a lawsuit in the US District Court that challenges the constitutionality of the state's law that has created its EPR program. And they claim that the act does not actually encourage a circular economy or modernize the state's recycling program, but instead threatens the viability of the wholesale distribution industry. So we're keeping a close eye on how this progresses. Moving on to Maine now, formal rulemaking is expected to be initiated this month for the packaging materials type list. In Minnesota then, producers were required to join a PRO by July 1st of this year. In Colorado, producer fees are due on January 1st, 2026. And then Washington and Maryland, producers are required to register with the PRO by July 1st, 2026. So now we're going to turn our attention to California, which was expected to be the state leading in program implementation. However, despite Senate Bill 5.4 entering into force in 2023, the rulemaking process for the implementing rules has faced continuous obstacles. A reset occurred in March of this year when the governor ordered CalRecycle to revise the draft rules in order to address industry pressure and clarify compliance. In August then, a revised draft was released and the formal rulemaking process began again with a consultation period that ends now on October 7th. If major changes are made to the revised rules, another revised draft will be released for a shorter consultation period of just 15 days. So we're expecting final approval of the rules in mid to late 2026, hopefully. So the most recent revision of the draft rules introduced a number of changes. Firstly, some definitions were clarified, such as covered material, food service ware, and producer identification. Some exclusions were refined and some exemption periods were also extended, specifically for small producers and materials with unique challenges. The data reporting increments were also changed from monthly to annual increments. And then also eco-modulated fees can now be implemented 2 years after the PRO plan is adopted. So in conjunction with the release of the revised draft rules, CalRecycle also issued updated guidance documents for producers just at the start of September. So one new category was added to the covered material categories list, or the CMC list. The CMC reporting guidelines were updated, and these contain definitions, a glossary of terms, a step-by-step key to categorizing, a full list of categories with examples also. And then finally, the source reduction reporting guidelines were also updated, and these provide guidance on how to estimate the amount of plastic covered material sold, offered for sale, or distributed in the state. So alongside the rulemaking process, there are still some important dates for producers to be aware of. So Circular Action Alliance, which is the designated PRO in California, opened the producer reporting portal on September 15th, earlier this month. And then producers are now required to submit their first report on their 2023 supply data by November 15th. Now, along with Senate Bill 54 and the draft implementing rules, Senate Bill 343, which is also known as the Truth in Recycling or the Truth in Labeling Act, forms part of California's broader strategy to reduce plastic pollution and build a circular economy for packaging. So this act has raised many questions for producers, but essentially it aims to target greenwashing by limiting recyclability claims and the use of the chasing arrow symbol or any other indicator of recyclability. It applies broadly to products and packaging, and these products and packaging may only contain such recyclability claims if they meet the following criteria. So firstly, if they are collected by curbside programs covering at least 60% of the California population, if the materials are accepted by recycling facilities serving at least 60% of the state program, or if the materials are used as feedstock for new products or packaging. So basically, if the recycled materials are used to make new products. And then finally, producers are also required to substantiate recyclability claims with any official data available. So similar to Senate Bill 54, this bill entered into force in 2022, but some important dates have also cropped up this year. So back in April, CalRecycle published the final findings for the Material Characterization Report, which determines what products and packaging materials are recognized as recyclable. This then subsequently triggered an 18-month transition period. So after October 4th, 2026, any product or packaging that shows the chasing arrow symbol or any recyclability claim will be considered misleading or deceptive unless the item is actually recyclable. So it's really imperative that producers now ensure that their products or packaging satisfy the recyclability criteria before this deadline. Additionally, new informational materials were published in August. So a minor update was made to Table 2 of the final findings report to reflect an increase in the collection and sortation of certain materials. And also an FAQ document was issued to assist manufacturers with provisions such as recyclability criteria, labeling restrictions, enforcement roles, and also compliance timelines. So now it's time to take a look at Canada. So while many provinces have already implemented packaging EPR or stewardship programs, namely Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, there have been some recent developments in Yukon and in Nova Scotia. So Yukon approved their stewardship plan earlier this year in May, and full implementation of the plan is scheduled to begin on November 1st of this year. And then in Nova Scotia, while their preliminary data reporting began back in 2024, full implementation of the plan is scheduled to begin on December 1st. So the next major milestone for packaging producers in Canada is Phase 1 reporting under the Federal Plastics Registry. So this reporting phase applies to products destined for household and residential waste streams specifically, and is grouped by 3 categories: rigid and flexible plastic packaging, which includes bottles, containers, wraps, and bags; single-use or disposable plastic items, such as straws, utensils, and plates; and also electronic and electrical equipment, so TVs, computers, and appliances that have plastic components. So the reports are due by September 29th of this year, so just in a few days, and they're based on 2024 data. The reports must contain info on the product category and subcategory, the resin type and resin source, the quantity per resin type and product category, and the calculation methods used for determining the quantity. So who is obligated to report during this phase? Well, it applies to any person that imports, manufactures, and places plastic on the market in Canada. So this could include producers, importers, manufacturers, brand owners, retailers, and marketplace facilitators. Now, this reporting phase does not apply to any person that places less than 1,000 kilograms of plastic products or packaging on the market per calendar year. And also any plastics that are in industrial, commercial, or institutional waste streams, they are also excluded from this reporting phase. So just a few more things to note. Environment and Climate Change Canada are currently accepting requests for 30-day reporting extension, which would bring the reporting deadline up to the end of October. But this is only being granted on a case-by-case basis. Secondly, then, confidentiality requests may also be submitted prior to the reporting deadline. And then finally, producers must also retain information used in their reports for 3 years after the reporting deadline. So that includes any information on calculations, measurements, etc. So in the event of non-compliance, penalties will include fines, and the amount can range to a maximum of $25,000 for an individual and $500,000 for a large corporation. And these amounts may also be doubled for any secondary or subsequent offences. Furthermore, then, anyone who fails to report on time or fails to report at all, or alternatively knowingly submits false or misleading information, they will also face penalties as outlined under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So overall, it's important that anyone who maybe didn't meet the reporting criteria or were exempt from this reporting phase, it's really important that they review their status each year now to determine whether or not they are required to report in the subsequent phases of the plastics registry. So while the Federal Plastics Registry takes effect, it's a slightly different story for the proposed framework on plastic labeling rules and recycled content. So we received a few questions on its status, as the draft regulations were expected to be published in the Canadian Gazette by the end of 2023, but obviously nothing has actually been issued since. So basically, the framework, which proposes recyclability and compostability labeling for consumer-facing plastics, and also mandatory recycled content thresholds, was subject to a consultation period that ended back in May 2023. In November 23, however, the federal court actually struck down the 2021 order that added plastic manufactured items to Schedule 1 of the Environmental Protection Act, and subsequently declared it invalid. In response to this then, the government appealed this decision in December of 23. So it's because the 2021 order and listing that was struck down, this was the actual legal basis for this proposed framework. So unfortunately now it's at a bit of a standstill and now remains on hold while the appeals process continues. So that covers the United States and Canada. And now I'm going to hand you over to Frida.
Thank you, Arun. So now I'm going to be discussing recent packaging developments in the UK. So to start off with, I have a list of the 3 core pieces of legislation that make up the UK's EPR packaging system. So we have the essential requirements for packaging regulations, the plastic tax regulations, and the producer responsibility obligations regulations as well here. So to look briefly at what happened this year. So the main focus for this year was on the recent enactment of the producer responsibility obligations, which entered into force on the 1st of January this year. So this is a vast piece of legislation that now encompasses the core requirements for the UK with regard to packaging. So we have a list of these requirements here, and they include registration obligations, reporting requirements, requirements for the payment of fees, recycling obligations, requirements for recording data, as well as requirements for certification. Now, the main question we have been receiving over recent months with regard to this regulation is the lack of marking and labeling obligations. So the main difference between this piece of legislation and the EU packaging regulation is that prior to its enactment, this regulation did have mandatory labeling requirements for recyclability. However, they were removed in response to the announcement that the EU was going to introduce its own scheme, as the British authorities felt that it would put an unnecessary burden on packaging producers in the UK to have to deal with 2 new schemes within Europe. With that being said, DIFRA has confirmed that packaging labeling obligations will be entering into force in the near future. The time frame for this is speculative at the moment, but it does seem that it will come into force in the next few years. Now, looking back into the content of this new regulation, similarly to the EU, the scope is quite broad. It does apply to all packaging products that are made of any material used for the containment, protection, handling, delivery, and presentation of goods. There are also a list of exemptions to the measures, and these are extended to reusable packaging and packaging which is destined to be exported from the UK, and packaging that happens to be in a deposit scheme. So in addition to the release of the new regulations, they were followed by 9 new guidance and policy documents. And these are essential reading for anybody who wants to ensure compliance with the new requirements. So they are quite detailed, and just to give you an overview of what they are covering, they do provide an overview of how to assess packaging waste using recyclability assessment methodology. This is a very important guidance document to be familiar with, because this methodology will be used to decide your eco-modulation fees for your packaging. There was also a new overview provided of EPR base fees for packaging for the period of this year and next. A revised instruction was provided for compiling and structuring data for EPR submissions. Additionally, there were revised instructions provided for registration and the payment of fees under the EPR system. And there are new instructions on how to assess household and non-household packaging. Lastly, there was a very good revised overview of EPR obligations for packaging producers released. And again, this is crucial for anyone who is producing packaging in the UK to be familiar with if they do wish to ensure compliance with the new requirements. Additionally, another point just to mention, the regulation will be repealing the remaining Northern Irish, Scottish and Welsh packaging waste regulations on the 1st of January next year. Following this, there will be a pan-UK EPR system in place. So following on from that, I just have a collection here of upcoming key dates under the UK's packaging EPR scheme. So on the 30th of September, we have the deadline for submitting applications for accreditation as a reprocessor or exporter. So this is applicable to anyone who is dealing with reprocessing or exporting waste packaging. Also in October, there will be the introduction of new waste disposal costs. On the 1st of October, we have the deadline for registering a compliance scheme for the 2026 registration year. Also on this date, we have the deadline for submitting packaging data for the first half of 2025, and this is applicable to large packaging producers. Then another date that I perhaps should have included here, but just to remind people, the 31st of January in 2026, that is the compliance deadline for ensuring compliance with this year's recycling obligations. Then on the 1st of April 2026, we have another deadline for the submission of packaging data for the period of the 1st of January to the 31st of December, and this data submission deadline is specific to small packaging producers. Also on this date, then there is the deadline for submitting nation data for the 2025 calendar year. And just for anyone who might not be familiar with this term, nation data is information on which nation states within the UK you have supplied packaging, and also which nation state you have disposed of waste packaging. So now moving towards Saudi Arabia. We've received a lot of questions on Saudi Arabia recently with regard to packaging requirements. And this, I believe, stems from the fact that the Saudi authorities have recently notified the WTO on the 21st of July of their revised packaging regulation, draft packaging regulation, I should say. And in addition to notifying the WTO of the revision, they also accompanied with it with a draft circular, which contains a list of packaging standards, 43 in total, which, if followed, will ensure compliance with the requirements that are set out in the draft regulation. Considering the text of the draft is quite a short document in comparison to many other legal texts that we see in other jurisdictions, these standards really are essential to understand in depth if you do want to ensure compliance with these new measures. Moving back to the text, why was it updated? Primarily, it was revised in order to harmonize it with the provisions of the recently approved technical regulation on product safety. With regard to the entry into force date, this hasn't changed from earlier versions. If approved, the new text will enter into force 180 days after its official publication. We also have a transition period for compliance. Again, this hasn't changed, and it's set for 1 year after the official publication of the regulation. So now looking into the contents of the draft regulation. So as with many of these packaging laws, it aims to ensure the protection, health and safety of packaging users, consumers, while also protecting the environment. Again, the scope of the regulation is quite broad. It applies to all packaging products used in the packing, protection, circulation and display of products, and it also extends to imported packaging. We do have a list of packaging products that are exempted under the draft, and they include primary and secondary packaging for food, drug, and cosmetic products. There is also an exemption for medical device packaging and medical supply packaging. And lastly, there is an exemption for food contact packaging, which is subject to provisions under the technical regulation on food safety for tools and equipment used in kitchens. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this is quite a short document, but it does include a few requirements which are related to the design and manufacture of packaging, safety requirements for packaging, obligations for reuse and recycling. There are chemical restrictions. Again, these fit in line with chemical restrictions that we see in jurisdictions globally. And there's also the obligation to provide product information. And lastly on this, there are no compliance deadlines set out in the current draft. So now moving towards India. So we have received a high volume of queries on the Indian plastic waste management rules this year. And I believe this is for a number of reasons, but they primarily come back to the fact that the rules were originally enacted in 2016. And since then, they have been amended numerous times over. And while official guidelines have been provided, they have yet to be updated to reflect recent changes. And ultimately, since there is no official consolidated version of the rules, it can be hard to navigate all aspects of the rules, which are spread across its multiple amendments. So now looking into the content of the rules. So the rules do aim to ensure the proper management of plastic waste, and they apply to both pre and post-consumer plastic packaging waste. And in particular, they contain requirements for producers, importers of plastic packaging, for brand owners, including online platforms, marketplaces, supermarkets, retail chains, and plastic waste processors. So here we just have a list of all the requirements that are contained within the rules. So there are requirements for the payment of fees in relation to plastic waste management. There are marking and labeling obligations contained within the rules. There are provisions for there are requirements for the provision of product information. There are obligations for the registration of producers, recyclers, and manufacturers. There are recycling obligations, and there are also requirements for the mandatory use of recycled plastic content in plastic packaging. And lastly, we do have annual reporting obligations on waste processing and recycling. So again, to bring it back to the areas that we received the most queries on. So in particular, there seems to be a lot of confusion around the actual labeling obligations contained within the rules. So piecing together all aspects of the in-force amendments, plastic packaging is required to be labeled with the name and registration certificate number of the producer or importer or the brand owner. Following recent changes, this information can be provided by barcode, quick response code, which can be printed on the plastic packaging. Additionally, this information could be provided in the product information brochure. There are, of course, some exemptions to these requirements. So exemptions are provided for plastic packaging covered under the packed commodities rules. And also there are exemptions for cases where plastic packaging where it's technically not feasible to print the required information. So in addition to those labeling requirements, we also have labeling requirements that are specific to highlighting the material content of the plastic packaging material. So we do have a requirement where recycled plastic packaging is required to be affixed with a label which states the recycled content by percent. And there is an Indian standard that can be used to demonstrate conformity for this. Then plastic packaging made from compostable plastics is required to be affixed with a label that states compostable only under industrial composting. And there is another Indian standard that can be used to ensure compliance with this. Then plastic packaging made from biodegradable plastic is required to be affixed with a label that states biodegradable in the X amount of days only in the specific environment. And lastly, all packaging bags which are made of plastic raw material are required to be marked with the statement not to be used in the manufacture of single-use plastic items prohibited under the plastic waste management rules. So lastly, then, the rules do contain a number of compliance deadlines, which I've compiled here. So every person who is engaged in recycling or processing of plastic waste is required to prepare and submit online an annual report by the 30th of April. Then every manufacturer and importer of plastic raw materials is required to prepare and submit online a quarterly report by the last day of the month following the quarter, and the annual report by the 30th of June each year. And lastly, every person who is engaged in the sale of plastic raw materials or an intermediate material used for the manufacture of plastic packaging is required to prepare and submit an annual report by the 30th of June each year. So that is everything from me. Thank you for your attention, and I'll pass you back to Orla.
Great. Thank you all so much. A lot of information, and still a huge amount of information that wasn't even covered. It didn't even scratch the surface, I can imagine. So thank you, though, for condensing it down into those slides. And thank you all for your attention so far. We now, as promised, have the floor open for the Q&A session. So if you have any question that you would like us to answer, please do let us know using the Ask a Question widget to the left side of your screen. And we have a lot of questions that have come in already, so we'll get cracking on them now. So the first question I have here is, what is expected for phase 2 reporting under the Canadian Federal Plastics Registry?
Yeah, I can take that one. So there was actually a public consultation launched in June earlier this year on what proposed content will be included for phase 2 reporting in the registry. So the proposal includes an expansion of the scope to now include product categories such as tires, transportation, construction, agriculture, fishing, and also textiles. And it also proposes to expand it to include products that are destined for industrial, construction, and institutional waste streams, so ICI streams. It also proposes that waste generators at ICI facilities will also be required to report on the actual total quantity of plastic waste, both generated or sent for diversion or disposal. So the deadline for phase 2 reporting is currently scheduled for September 29th, 2026, so the same as this year's reporting deadline. But the consultation closed in July, so we can hopefully expect to see some final plans issued within the next few months.
Great, thank you, Rowan. The next question is, does the PPWR apply to Northern Ireland?
I'll take that one, Orla. So yes, the EU packaging reg does generally apply to Northern Ireland. This was confirmed earlier this year by the EU Commission. They published a notice in February on this, but where they did say that the reg does apply to Northern Ireland, but it does list specific provisions which are excluded from application in Northern Ireland. These include, I think, provisions relating to reuse targets and EPR mainly. And if you can't find a notice, I'm sure you can let us know and we can forward it to you.
Great, thanks, Connor. Has Indonesia recently implemented a new plastic EPR law?
I can take that. So this is something that we've been looking into because there's been a lot of discussion around a new 30% reduction rate for plastic waste in Indonesia for 2029. This actually is an old compliance deadline that is in force, but it was announced in a 2019 regulation. So I know that an Indonesian minister has been speaking about this quite a lot recently in international conferences. So there isn't a new piece of legislation out. This is from existing legislation that we've had access to for a while. Thanks.
Great. Okay, thanks, Frida. And then I'll cover one more question during this live session, but as mentioned, I can see plenty more have been coming in as we've been answering, or as they've been answering them here. So we'll follow up with you directly after the webinar if it's not covered here during the live session. But for the last question, are there any penalties if we don't comply with Portuguese packaging labelling or waste sorting information requirements?
I'll take that one again, Orla. So yes, there are penalties. We were speaking about Decree Law 152D 2017 earlier, and there are penalties provided under this decree law, I believe under Article 90. And I think the fines, depending on the level of non-compliance, can range from anywhere between €12,000 up to over €200,000.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Connor, and thanks to Ruan and Frida as well for answering those questions. And with that, I would just like to thank you all for tuning in with us today. We really hope you found today's presentation helpful and look forward to seeing you in our upcoming webinars. And thank you again to Connor, Ruan and Frida for all of your expert insights. Plenty of work to be done as well after the webinar with all the questions that have come in. But in the meantime, you can check out our resources section on the website to stay updated and to access our latest webinars, white papers and blogs. We've plenty of upcoming webinars scheduled and other webinars that you can access on demand. So make sure to check that out. And speaking of upcoming content, our next webinar, Chemicals Quarterly Q3 2025 Regulatory Update, is scheduled for October 8th. So we do hope to see you there. Thanks again for your attention today.